Gigantic, ominous, marauding colossi, a cryptic, nebulous world full of ancient secrets, immense landscapes that stretch as far as the eye can see, or at least as far as your PlayStation can render them. These are the most fundamental pillars of the game Shadow of the Colossus, a game originally released on the PlayStation 2, but has seen remastered releases across 2 additional PlayStation consoles, and corresponding praise for each version. This is a feat that very few intellectual properties under the PlayStation umbrella have accomplished with an entire franchise of sequels, let alone the exact same game. With each release, Shadow of the Colossus managed to add to its fanbase with new players while getting old ones to come back for the new version. The original 2005 version of Shadow of the Colossus sold an impressive 140,000 copies within a week of its first release just in Japan alone, earning it the coveted PlayStation's Greatest Hits moniker soon after. And subsequent releases of the game would feature that striking red label given to PS2 games that we are all so familiar with now. Shadow would go on to be recognized in just about every conceivable way for a video game at that time. This would include awards for Best Game Design, Best Visual Arts, 3 Innovation Awards, and being recognized as the Game of the Year at the 2005 Game Developers' Choice Awards. At the following year's DICE Summit, Shadow of the Colossus would receive the distinction of Outstanding Achievement in Art Direction, as well as other distinctions. GameSpot gave the game Best PS2 Game Award and recognized its soundtrack as the best of the year it was released. This unmitigated success would, of course, lead to a PS3 version, which was more or less an optimized port of the original game, coupled with the developer's previous game, Eco, on physical releases. This would also sell and review well, as the game ran much better and even had a few tweaks to the responsiveness of the controls, but other than that was largely left unchanged. The big overhaul would come from Bluepoint's PS4 remake in 2018, which would feature all new textures and assets built from the ground up, a new, more modern control scheme, and a remastered soundtrack. But what exactly did this little game made by a team of less than 50 people do to beat out so many arguably better equipped and more experienced developers and receive so much praise and support from Sony? For starters, it's impossible to ignore the unique nature of Shadow of the Colossus. It's a game that just stands out. The setting, the story, the ethereal nature, the gameplay tailor-made for its own purposes, all add up to an experience that can't even begin to compare with anything else. Showing up to a forbidden land to save the soul of another character by slaying 16 giant monsters is something that even the best action-adventure games that came after it can't hold a candle to in terms of originality. Team Eco, really more than most developers these days, seemed to intimately understand the concept of less is more. With only a whisper of a story at the beginning and not much more than that as it progresses, the world jumps out at you as an incredibly believable and convincing place that almost seems like it could exist somewhere. While the events of the game are largely left up to interpretation, whatever you do interpret them as feels right. So if nothing else, Shadow of the Colossus is an impressive display of plausibility despite how nebulous it can be. The whole thing is largely brought together by gaming's main handful of elements: gameplay, presentation, visual style, and audio design, all of which we'll talk about right now. The presentation of Shadow is its own beast. As with most games that have some sort of an artistic element to them, Shadow of the Colossus has its own tone and loose color scheme that it largely abides by to keep its experience feeling like its own. The long stretches of desolate land, largely populated with rocks, occasional trees, and massive fields of grass, create a lot of washed out browns, greens, and grays. This is broken up sporadically with the occasional bodies of water, one very dense forest section, and ruins that play with verticality to add some nice variety, but ultimately the game leans into its look of desolation, bareness, and the vague feeling that perhaps many eons ago there was something more here. The whole landscape does seem to suggest that there are layers of mystery all around, but are simply too washed away by time to ever be fully understood. Just as the landscapes and scenery can be awe-inspiring, the colossi themselves are overwhelming and intimidating. Even the smaller ones strike a special sense of urgency in the player to figure out their weak spots and defeat them despite the odds. Speaking of the colossi, the battles with them really are the core of the experience, even though they are not the only thing you'll be doing in the game. They all inspire their own shades of awe and intimidation upon first seeing them, but slowly reveal their secrets to you as you study them. Using the environment around them, whether that be land, water, or other structures, to examine them closely is the key. Staying alive while they try to attack, and continuing to study them from all angles will eventually yield results, as they slowly reveal their weak spots through various tells. With a little patience and creativity on your part, you'll eventually discover areas of the colossi that will be vulnerable to either Wander's arrows or sword. From there, you can start to formulate a plan to reach those spots, whether that be from climbing them from behind, baiting them to come at you, or some other means. While taking down the beast might have seemed like an absurd idea at first glance, once you put your mind to it and formulate your strategy, it becomes more and more just a matter of execution and thinking on your feet as the Colossus tries to shake you off their back. Few games have ever given us a comparable sense of accomplishment to the feeling of slaying these beasts for the first time. While some may feel slightly put off by the somewhat wonky controls, especially in the original version, pushing through that to conquer the game's challenges is more than worth it. Aside from the visuals, the audio is perhaps even more outstanding. Sound effects certainly get the job done, with everything from Argo's galloping to Wander's arrows firing, but the real auditory star of the show here is the musical score, which commands your attention with every sweeping chord progression, the mysterious tones of the temple section, the encouraging chords that permeate the long rides to your next Colossus, and finally, the booming epic melodies of the battles themselves that drive you forward despite the seemingly insurmountable odds. By the end of the game, you might have heard the same handful of tunes several times, but they never lose their impact because of how well they are performed and how perfect they are for those moments. So, as it is painfully obvious at this point, Shadow of the Colossus was not just an excellent game for its mysterious world, outstanding graphics, or once-in-a-lifetime soundtrack. It has all of the above. Everything you could ask for in a game like this, Shadow has in spades: atmosphere, engrossing gameplay, and a story that lures your mind into endless contemplation. Shadow of the Colossus really just has it all, and while it might not be the type of experience that speaks to everybody, any reasonable person has to admit, it's one hell of a game. That's it for this video. If you enjoyed and would like to see more, feel free to hit that subscribe button and hit the notification bell to ensure you'll be notified when new videos go up.